Good morning, students of British and American culture. First, I want to make a small correction. It's probably something you might not care about or have noticed, but I think I did say Henry I was the one who was friends with Thomas Becket and made him the Archbishop, and then consequently, announced that he would rather have him dead, and then he was killed. But it was Henry II. So that was a mistake. Henry I was actually the third son of William, and Henry II was another generation later. So that's there's a little bit more of a gap between William and Henry II. But it is another step, like I said, in this sort of balance between the church and the state that's going to become a main theme of British culture as we move forward. When William took over England, as I said, he basically said every inch, every pyong, every acre of England belonged to him personally. And so that was only through his grace and of his granting of land that anybody had access to it, and he returned it to all the people, and he had control. One of the ways that he had control over England was he replaced everyone in the English church with Norman and French clergy. Okay, so he used the church. But now, by the time you get to Henry II, which is about 100 years later, you get the sort of a power struggle between the church and the state. So as I said, the church was a very, very influential system because they handled a lot of the daily life. They were involved in the daily life of all the people, whereas the king was more dealing with international affairs, the upper class, war, and those sorts of things. So to the average English person, the church might be more important than the king at this point. This is medieval life, remember? Now, before we go forward to talk about what happens in the 14th century, because we just talked about Magna Carta, which was 1215, and we mentioned Richard, and Richard went on crusade just before the beginning of the 13th century. But things are going to go forward very quickly through the 13th century into the 14th century, because I'm not going to talk about the 100 Years' War too much. I'm just going to mention it in passing. But before we do that, let's just go right back to the introduction again. On page 38 and 39, I give you another sort of framework to try and understand how these stories, how these people, how these events, how these objects can be analyzed, and how you can write about them, and how you can figure out what they mean, okay? So this whole section here about cultural studies is very important. I mentioned already about the relationship between dominant culture, counterculture, and subculture. When you take a particular cultural symbol, you can look at it from its, kind of break it down into parts, all right? So you might look at it from its social context, its cultural context, and its historical context. So let me explain what that means. If you're looking at something in its social context, you're looking at what, analyzing the world around that person, place, or thing, okay? So when it was created, what it was related to, what it said, right? What it meant at the time, in that moment. That's what the social context of a symbol is. Then, and this is very important because these days we have debates about whether these symbols should be kept or not based on their social context or perhaps on their cultural context. So what does it actually mean? What is the ideological value of this thing? So yes, it's a red cross. and it's a blue cross in the background, and it's split by another red cross. That's a Union Jack. But and that is a combination of the crosses of St. George and St. Andrews and the Irish cross as well, right? You make the Union Jack from that. It's a symbol of union, right? But it means different things to different people. The value of it for the British is imperialism, right? It symbolizes not just the union of Scotland and England as two kingdoms that have become partners and become more powerful, but it also projects power to the world. When you see the Union Jack now, it doesn't mean the same things it did 200 years ago. 200 years ago, it meant a powerful country that you might want to, if you were trading something or you were an enemy country, you might prepare to fight or run or hide. Now when you see the Union Jack, you probably think of certain products like a car, like a Mini, or a Rolls Royce, or the royal family, or I don't know, London or something like that. The symbol has changed and the cultural value and the branding of it has changed. So these forces are flexible, and it sort of gives you like this cultural milieu, which describes the relationship between the cultural forces and the symbol. And these are flexible, and they change over time. But social context is what it meant at the time. Cultural is sort of transcendent. You can take different points of time and you can talk about different ideas, and those ideas don't often completely go away, you know? So, you know, when you drive around a Mini with a Union Jack on it, you can't disconnect that Union Jack from the fact that that is a symbol of British imperialism. You've got the flag that they used to stick in the ground all over the world to claim land for the British Empire. They put the flagpole down in India and Bangladesh and Pakistan and Australia and South Africa and Canada and so on, right? That's the same mark. So it may not be as terrifying or disgusting or offensive as putting a Nazi flag down somewhere, but it doesn't mean that it's completely disconnected from what its cultural value was hundreds of years ago, or even more recently. I shouldn't say hundreds of years ago. World War II happened 75 years ago. So it's not that long ago that British flag meant military power, imperialism, and colonialism. So you have to be careful how you use that flag. Now, there's historical context. And historical context means, you know, relating what the thing is to things that happened before and afterwards, right? So you analyze the thing, well, this Winston Churchill was like this because his ancestor was the Duke of Marlborough, and his whole family had a history of, you know, involvement in civil service and in the military and the administration, and he was naturally, you know, groomed for the role of Lord Admiral, and eventually he was a natural to become the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and the British Empire during World War II. If you take things that are connected historically to the object, person, or thing that you're talking about, then you're analyzing it from a historical perspective, right? You look at the big picture and you look at all the interactions between the things from the future and the past, and how they influenced what happened to the symbol itself, okay? Now, if you can do this, then you can be a little bit more sensitive to how people feel when you throw symbols around without recognizing their context, right? There was a bar in Daejeon called Nazi Bar, which is gone now, but that's never going to invoke the right kind of responses from anybody who's aware of the historical or cultural context. The social context of the Nazi bar might be fine. Might be a bunch of Koreans and foreigners having a drink and on Friday night chatting about life and having a good time. But the name itself has some very, very serious ideological connections to Nazism and fascism. And we all know that it's also connected to something called World War II, where tens of millions of people died. So that's not the right symbol. Culturally, you don't want to associate yourself with that normally, because that's going to get a certain response, which is really negative. Okay? So these are the kind of things you have to be aware of as we go through various people and various events and buildings, decisions, organizations. There's going to be a sort of a mixture of these things. Some things, the social context kind of fades away, and then the cultural context gets picked up, and then it transcends whatever happened at the time. When we get to George Washington, for example, there's lots of things that George Washington didn't do. There's lots of things that George Washington isn't known for that aren't exactly laudable. He wasn't a perfect human being, but nobody cares about that. Nobody cares about his attitude or his selfishness or his pride or his condescension or any of those things, because the historical context and the cultural context have completely overwhelmed anything that he did in his personal life. Plus, he in the social context, he also was a fantastic commander, and he did win the War of Independence. So we'll let the other things go, and they get overshadowed, but we should discuss them. So as we go through, so far we've talked about kings and queens a lot. The only one that doesn't seem to have very many demerits is King Arthur, and he, of course, is not a real person. So, like I said, Richard the Lionheart does his best to be Arthur in the flesh, but of course he runs around insulting everybody, and he's very proud of himself, and eventually he gets captured, gets ransomed, and gets shot by a crossbow bolt in France. And this is probably what he deserved, because he was asking for it the entire time. He made a lot of enemies along the way with his extreme sense of destiny and his bravado. Now, so we're back to where we left off. Basically, King John, he was forced to sign the Magna Carta in 1215, right? So moving back to the correct part of the book, we have power sharing with the people on page 73. That discusses the Magna Carta and how at the time it didn't have a strong effect, but it kept being referred to and being revived. Even though each king tried to toss it in the garbage and get rid of it, every king that needed the support of the barons had to promise again to follow what was in the Magna Carta. So it would never died. It just kept, being squashed by more powerful kings, but every new king really had to revive it and promise to do it. Otherwise, he wouldn't get the support of the kingdom. So this is what happens. Excuse me. I got a bit of a cold. This is what happens is in England, because they have these lands in France, because William, his patrimony actually was Normandy, and that it was lost by John. Subsequent kings after John, the Edwards, Edward the First, Edward the Second, Edward the Third. We're not going to get into the Edwards in too much detail, but basically, they decide that that land belongs to them still, and that they're going to reclaim it. The French king and the dynasty of the French starts to become unstable. They don't have, just like Edward the Confessor, they don't have a prince either. So now suddenly there's no crown prince in France. The closest person to be the king ends up being Edward. Okay, so Edward, this is now Edward the Third. Edward the First runs around England, subdues Wales, fights in Scotland. Edward II loses against Scotland. So there's a whole, we'll talk about Scotland a little bit later. We'll rewind and talk about Scotland later. But basically, there's a Scottish War of Independence. Edward I goes up to Scotland, has a war with Scotland and defeats them. But he dies, and Edward II is a horrible king. And he's unable to keep the Scots under control. And so they start winning. And so there's sort of two halves of this Scottish War of Independence. And the Scottish win the Scottish War of Independence in the second half and maintain their independence. So that's why it was very close at one point that there might be one kingdom called the United Kingdom in the early 14th century, but it didn't happen because Edward II was incompetent. So Wales kind of gets incorporated into England. So England and Wales are one country, but Scotland remains independent. Now that the war has settled, though, Scotland has its territory. England and Wales are joined. And the French throne is vacant, just like a hotel. There's nobody there. Edward III claims that he is, through his mother, the closest relative, so he should be the King of France. The French decide that's not what they want. They don't want an English king as the King of France, so they decide that you can't be the king through your mother. The lineage, the blood has to come through your father. So Edward says, well, you're wrong, so I'm going to take an army and I'm going to take over France anyway. This starts the whole 100 Years' War. And this is the beginning of the 14th century. The timing is terrible, okay? This is why it says the trauma of complete devastation and a tumultuous century on page 74 and 75. Magna Carta is in 1215. 100 years later exactly, in 1315, there's 7 years of bad weather. And in 1315, it's particularly bad. It's wet, it's cold, everything is going rotten, there's not enough food, people are starving. This is called the Great Famine, and it happens all over Europe. So economically, health-wise, resource-wise, politically and socially, these countries are in terrible shape. It's like the coronavirus, but worse, okay? It's like, well, it's more like a climate crisis like we're having now, but we really haven't felt it yet. Maybe in 30 years, when all the crops are dying and everything's too hot and there's not enough food everywhere and we're crawling around, and then some countries decide to go to war, that will be similar to what's happening here. The kings and queens of England and France decide that they're going to fight, even though their countries are a mess. So the whole 14th century, they continue fighting. And in the middle of the century, while this fighting is going on, it's called the 100 Years' War, but it's about 117 years. And there's several breaks. They take a break twice. While this is happening, something even worse happens, the Black Death, which is the coronavirus times 1 million. So right now, when you get the coronavirus, about 1 or 2% of people end up dying, but we still need more data collection because not everybody who has gotten sick has been tested. So of the people being tested, 1 or 2% of people who get infected die, which scares us a lot. Now, what happens with the Black Death that comes in the middle of the 14th century and rolls across Europe, when it gets to England, it eventually kills about 30% of the entire population of Europe, right? You're talking about, if you're talking about Korea, you're talking about something like 15 million people. I think the number of people in Korea that's died is 1,000, a few thousand at the most. It's a tiny number compared to 15 million would be everybody would lose one person in their family. If you have a family of 3, you lose one person. If you have a family of 6, you lose 2. Okay, that's what happens for the middle decades of the Black Death. Now, just like the coronavirus, upper class people don't get sick as often. They're socially distanced from everybody else. They don't live in dirty conditions. They don't come in contact with as many people. So only one person in the royal family died, and very few of the upper class people died from the plague. But the peasants and the working class people, the large majority of the people suffered immensely. And there were so many bodies that they couldn't even remove them. London lost about 50% of its population. So the Black Death is the most devastating disaster that's ever happened that we know of in the history of Europe. And they continued to fight the 100 Years' War in the middle of this, which is just astounding to me that despite your countries falling apart because of infection, that you would continue to fight. There were, like I said, pauses, but on and off they kept fighting, despite the fact the Black Death came from 1348, then it came back again 5 years later, and then it came back again. It didn't just come once. It came in waves, and they continued to have these battles anyway. The English were winning. Maybe that's why they kept fighting. But they, at the same time, thousands and thousands of their people were dying of disease. So it came probably as a bacteria carried on fleas, and the fleas were on rats, and the rats were on ships. And so they came on the boats through the Crimea into the Mediterranean. So they infected, Italy and the southern Mediterranean European countries first, and made their way north and finally onto the island of England. So this disrupted trade, it disrupted education. The church, the reputation of the church was diminished. Some people believed this was God punishing people for their sin, for bad behavior. This was God sending plagues, like in the Bible, like killing the firstborn sons and rains of locusts and frogs and stuff like that. So they thought it was a divine punishment. So some people thought, some people thought it was the end of the world. Some people thought it was the devil. There was all kinds of different beliefs in why. They didn't understand medically what was going on. They tried all sorts of things. There was all kinds of scapegoating. Jewish communities were attacked and foreigners were attacked. Belgian merchants in England were attacked and blamed, because the ships brought them in. There were these ships they called death ships too. They would just kind of float into the harbor, and there'd be like 3 people alive on them, and the rest of the crew would be dead. And nobody wanted to let that ship land, dock, and let the 3 alive people off and bring the disease into the city. So, they started closing their gates and burning houses, and all kinds of things happened, and chaos. The church was not able to offer a whole lot of comfort. A lot of the priests didn't want to do the last rites on people as they were dying because they would get infected. But a lot of them did, and then they died. So, some of the best priests and the best clergy did their duty and did the last rites for these people to send their souls on to heaven and to bless them. And they contracted the bacteria, and then they died. And the ones that refused to do it, stayed in the churches or stayed in their homes or stayed away and maybe survived. So you had, a less qualified, less numerous, less educated group of clergy, and then they needed priests, and then they needed monks, and they needed abbots and abbesses and all of these people. And so the whole generation basically got younger after everybody who had valuable trades, if the only blacksmith in the village died, then, who would fix the shoes for the horses and make hammers and tools and nails and tongs and things like that? So specialized professions, the people got younger in all of them, and in particular, there was a lot of clergy. There were a lot of people in the church that were less qualified and had not studied at Oxford and Cambridge, and were not as well prepared to manage their responsibilities in the church. So the reputation of the church suffered quite a bit, even though some people were even more superstitious than before. There wasn't a whole lot of help coming from the church in some ways, because they were losing a lot of their best clergy. What they were dying off. So there's a lot of consequences to this. Lots of people died. Younger people tended to survive more often, as usual. The lifespan of these people was pretty short anyway. So, we were talking about people who are dying when they're 40, and their expected lifespan is 50 anyway. But this seemed to kill everybody. It disrupted everything. It disrupted trade, it disrupted government, it disrupted the church. The death toll in some places was as high as 50%, in some Italian cities above that. That's where they were hit the most. It was very densely populated in Italy as well. So one thing that did have a long-term effect, the population didn't really recover for hundreds of years. And so this effect was that there were less people to work, and so each individual's labor was worth more. So although trade was disrupted, the reputation of the church was damaged, land was not worked as much. They lost a lot of production, right? Farms just weren't being farmed. People weren't working on them because there was nobody there. Forests regrew and reclaimed land that had been cleared and used for farmland. Early modern England was a lot more forested than the 13th century was, because the Black Death killed so many people that there wasn't people to clear the trees. So the trees just started growing back. I guess you could consider that nowadays a positive effect because of climate change, but back then it meant that there was less food being produced, so that was a problem. The main thing, though, was that labor became more expensive, and this was a benefit. This was a benefit for the people because it gave them more leverage. They could have more money. This would allow them to support their families better. They would be able to buy better tools. They might have a better farm animal, an ox or a horse. They might be able to rent more land or even buy their own farm because the wages were that much higher. The landlords did not like this, obviously. Okay, so we're almost to 30 minutes already, and I think there's a lot of information there for you to digest. You need to make sure you know about the famine in 1315, and you need to straighten out all the things about the Black Death, because that's definitely going to be a multiple choice question, and perhaps it's going to be a midterm question as well, okay? The rest of the chapter is about two people, Geoffrey Chaucer and John Wycliffe, and they live during the Black Death. They're born during the Black Death, and they experience this whole century of what I said, tumultuous, this chaotic century. They experience it and they grow up in it, and they both have a very profound influence on the English language and English society. So I think for our next lecture, which will be next week, the one before the exam, I will cover Chaucer and Wycliffe, and I'll do the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, and that will finish chapter 2, and that will make us ready for quiz number 2, which is not this Friday. Okay, don't get this. You got to listen to these lectures carefully. I'll write it down on the site just so you don't get confused and overreact. This Friday is the 26th. This lecture I'm recording right now, this is Monday. This lecture is going up on Friday. So you should be watching this on Friday. And then there's going to be a lecture early next week, which will be Chaucer and Wycliffe and the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. And that'll finish chapter 2. And then it looks like on April 2nd, that will be our quiz number 2. Okay? I'll write this down on the website just to make sure you're not confused. Remember, listen to me carefully. Start at 10, finish before 10:10. Preferably 10:09 or earlier. Okay? All right, thanks for listening. This is Monday, but by the time you see this, it'll be Friday. So enjoy your weekend. Have a good day.